So today, Square Enix revealed the final piece of DLC for the game Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins, and it's going to be called Different Future, and the main villain is going to be the Emperor from Final Fantasy II. So with this new trailer and announcement, my brain started going nuts, and I started to think about all of the possibilities that you could have with a spin-off like Final Fantasy Origins. So in regards to that DLC, I don't know how the Emperor comes to this world. He mentions in the trailer that the power of the crystals is what drew him there, so how he gets to this world and encounters Jack and his party is really interesting to me, and I think that's going to be a big part of that story. But the concept of this DLC, the concept of Stranger of Paradise in particular, really got my brain going, and I started to think about how you could continue this franchise, this spin-off, going forward. So with Stranger of Paradise, it's had a little bit of a rocky history, to say the least. When it was first revealed, it was kind of weird and confusing and underwhelming to a degree because we were all expecting a Neo-like, Souls-like Final Fantasy game. And when we got that trailer, it was dark, it was muddy, it looked kind of like a PS2 game. The overall vibe was very just edgelord and cringy, and it got to the point where the main character of Jack and his friends became a huge ass meme on the internet when it came to chaos and finding chaos and killing chaos and we need to become chaos. It got out of hand. But once the game actually came out and people played it and they experienced the story and that really cool twist near the end of the game, I think people started to view Stranger of Paradise a little differently, and it went from pointing and laughing at Stranger of Paradise to, wow, this is actually kind of cool and interesting, and it's honestly very endearing. And Stranger of Paradise, the story, without getting too into detail about the story because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, if you want to go online and watch the story playthrough or watch the twist ending, I highly suggest it because it is really well done in my personal opinion, and it gives a completely new perspective on Final Fantasy and the character of Garland, and it gives me a completely new respect for those two things. It not only gives Garland more depth, but he ends up becoming a bit of an anti-hero who says, F you to the establishment, I'm gonna take you guys down. And it acts almost like a prequel and expansion to the original Final Fantasy in that game's story. Also in the description down below, I'll leave a link to a YouTuber by the name of Unbroken Odds who has a fantastic story explained video for Stranger of Paradise where he goes through and breaks down the entire story and shows how it affects the events of Final Fantasy I in case you don't want to play through the game yourself or you don't want to watch a super long let's play of the Stranger of Paradise story. With the introduction of this DLC, Different Future, I started to think about how you could continue Final Fantasy Origins going forward. So we've had two DLCs for this game previously. There was one involving Bahamut and the second one involving Gilgamesh, and now we've got the Emperor. So the idea of Final Fantasy Origins continuing forward is really cool to me because I think there's honestly two things you could do here. You could release a sequel to Stranger of Paradise which focuses on Jack and his party encountering different villains from the worlds of Final Fantasy. So for example, Different Future, it's the Emperor. How does the Emperor get here? What does he want? What's his relationship going to be going forward with Garland? Will he remember any of this when the story is said and done? That premise of Jack and his team fighting different villains is really cool to me. Even if it's just DLC stuff, imagine controlling Jack and you're fighting Kefka, or you're fighting Sephiroth, or you're fighting Golbez, or you're fighting all of these different villains, but in the world of Stranger of Paradise. And I think going forward, either making future DLCs at some point or future games shouldn't be all that difficult because you have pre-existing assets that you can use. There's stuff from Stranger of Paradise, but if you look at the DLC and the character models from the main game as well as the DLC, characters like the Warrior of Light and the Emperor look very close to their Dissidia NT counterparts. So I think they're pulling from that game and placing them into Stranger of Paradise, especially if you look at the move sets for those characters. It's very much what you would find in the Dissidia games. So I think building upon that going forward probably wouldn't be too difficult. The second alternative is to just have Final Fantasy Origins continue on by delving more into the backstory of the villains. This could be a franchise dedicated to the villains. So for all we know, maybe at the end of this DLC, the Emperor wins. And then going forward, if they wanted to, they could make a game focused on the Emperor and his backstory and his motivations and whatnot, and you could pick different villains from each respective Final Fantasy to focus on and give them a backstory and an actual origin. And this is technically something they've already explored previously with a game like Final Fantasy XV, which focused on the main villain of that game being Ardyn, and you actually got to play episode Ardyn and experience his entire backstory. You saw where he started from, the fact that he actually wasn't a bad dude, he was just placed in some really awful circumstances, and that's what transformed him into the villain we see from 15. So it's not an entirely new concept for Square Enix to do. I just hope that they take Final Fantasy Origins going forward, and that's the format for this series. Focus on the villains, tell more of their backstory, and let us control them, and I think it acts as a really cool expansion for their respective Final Fantasy games. And before we end today's video, let's take a look at that community poll that I posted on my channel last week, where I asked you guys, do you think that Final Fantasy 16 will come to PC, and if so, when? 20% of you said yes, 6 months after PS5 exclusivity ends. 76% of you said yes, 1 to 2 years after PS5 exclusivity ends, and 5% of you said no. So obviously a couple of months ago we found out that 16 was going to have a 6-month exclusivity window, meaning that 6 months after the game's release, it would be free range for that game to hit other consoles. And because this is Sony we're talking about here, things can always change at the drop of a hat behind the scenes. For all we know, they could extend their exclusivity deal with Square Enix at the last minute, and then it'll take even longer for 16 to hit PC. But I really do think that 16 is going to come to PC, but it's going to take at least 1 to 2 years. It's not going to happen overnight, unfortunately. Now, with that being said, please make sure to check out my community tab on my channel. I post polls on there from time to time, and I also do post updates in regards to the channel, so feel free to check that out to stay up to date with what I'm doing. And please let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think about Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins? Would you like to see Square Enix continue the Final Fantasy Origins name as a spin-off and focus on different villains? Or would you like to see Jack and his party continue to fight different Final Fantasy villains? Leave those thoughts in the comments down below. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.